Welcome you all to the 36th lecture in Democracy Dialogue series, organized by New Socialist Initiative, an ideological political platform. This is Subhash Gatade. Our guest this evening is Professor Niraja Gopal Jayal. We are extremely thankful to her for accepting our invite and ready and sparing her such precious time to deliver this lecture. Professor Jayal joined King's India Institute as Avantha Chair in 2021. She was formerly head professor at the Center for Law and Governance at JNU. She has also visiting appointments at Princeton University, King's College London, and EHESS Paris. The focus of her research has been democracy, citizenship, and welfare in India. She has many books to her credit, the most recent one being Citizenship Imperiled, India's Fragile Democracy, Reforming India, the Nation Today, Representing in Ethnic Diversity and Governance of Public Institutions, Representing India, Ethnic Diversity and Governance of Public Institutions, Citizenship and its Discontents, Democracy and the State, Welfare, Secularism and Development in Contemporary India. She has co-edited the Oxford component of Companion for Politics in India. This evening, she will be talking about democratic dogmas and disquiets. Friends, please welcome Professor Niraja Gopal Jayal.
Thank you so very much, Subhashji and Ravi. Thank you both for the invitation to speak at this forum, and especially to speak on this milestone Republic Day, which marks 75 years of the adoption of our Constitution. I've been asked to speak on democracy, so it might be appropriate to begin with the sobering thought that we have failed spectacularly on two of the three things that Dr. Ambedkar said were necessary to maintain our democracy: to keep bhakti or hero worship at bay, and to not be content with political democracy, which can't last in the absence of social democracy. On his third injunction, to hold fast to constitutional methods for achieving our social and economic objectives, the record may be somewhat more mixed. But in that famous speech of November 25th, 1949, Dr. Ambedkar also referred to fraternity, which he described as just another name for democracy, and saying that, and I'm going to quote, "Democracy is not merely a form of government, it is primarily a mode of associated living, of conjoint communicated experience. It is essentially an attitude of respect and reverence towards fellow men," unquote. Now, clearly a very distinctive understanding of democracy, and one that deserves recovery in our country today. When Subhashji asked me to speak on the problem of, as he put it, democracy undoing itself, he also asked me to address a really quite impossible question of how a modern, liberal, enlightened constitution like ours can be safeguarded, he said, against the stresses of competitive electoral democracy. I saw this and I see this as an opportunity to reflect collectively on our expectations of democracy at the present political moment. So this necessarily will entail some conceptual exploration, and I apologize in advance that the talk may be a little bit like Democratic Theory 101. Subhashji's phrase, democracy undoing itself, could not be more appropriate, not just for India, but for the world. The last 2 decades have seen alarm bells ringing all across the world, signaling the erosion of democracy. And these have been described in a range of ways, from the rather gentle and kid-gloved term democratic deficit to the stronger, even dramatic, death of democracy. If we step back in time a little, we can recall the mid-70s, when military dictatorships and coups d'etat were commonplace across the world. But only 20 years after that, by the mid-1990s, scholars were hailing the consolidation of democracy, describing it famously as the only game in town. Obviously, the unraveling of the Soviet Union had something to do with that. But the euphoria of the 1990s has now dissipated, with the world being almost evenly divided between 91 democracies and 88 autocracies, according to the latest annual democracy report of the Varieties of Democracy project, which tells us that the share of the world's population living in autocratizing countries overshadows the share living in democratizing countries, 48% higher than just 10 years ago. And the decline is most stark in Eastern Europe, South Asia, and Central Asia. Latin America bucks the global trend a little bit with some increase in democracy levels. But overall, 71% of the world's population lives in autocratizing countries. 44% of that, that is 3.5 billion people, live in electoral autocracies, and that includes us. Only 20% or only 29% of the world's population, that's 2.3 billion people, live in liberal and electoral democracies. Clearly, democracy has fallen on hard times in many places across the world, and you can see this phenomenon depicted in the titles of multiple books published in the last few years. And I will ask Yatindra to just display them by sharing his screen. He has the slides. Yeah. Look at these books. Stephen Levitsky and Daniel Ziblatt, How Democracies Die. David Runciman, How Democracy Ends. Nadia Urbinati, Democracy Disfigured. Adam Shivorsky, Crises of Democracy. Yasha Monk, The People versus Democracy. Astra Taylor, Democracy May Not Exist, but We'll Miss It When It's Gone. And Anne Applebaum, Twilight of Democracy, The Seductive Lure of Authoritarianism. I would be remiss if I didn't mention similar books on India. The first one is up here, Debashish Roy Chowdhury and John Keane, To Kill a Democracy, India's Passage to Despotism. Dinsha Mistry, Sumit Ganguly, and Larry Diamond edited The Troubling State of India's Democracy. And most recently, Rahul Bhatia's The New India, The Unmaking of the World's Largest Democracy. Thank you, Yatindra. Now, as some of these titles suggest, the anxiety that democracy is slipping into forms of authoritarianism frequently finds expression in terms of palpably physical metaphors, or metaphors that relate to a pathology of decline, illness, death. David Runciman's book, How Democracies End, actually depicts democracy as suffering a midlife crisis, even something akin to a nervous breakdown. Nadia Urbinati's book, Democracy Disfigured, identifies what she describes as disfigurations and even alarming mutations that can be observed in the basic traits composing the democratic figure. In many such works, democracy is often depicted as a living being, a sick or aging individual, a patient struck by some terrible terminal disease that can plausibly lead to the end of life itself. As an aside, it's perhaps worth noting that so many epitaphs and elegies to democracy were not being written when military coups and dictatorships occurred in the global south. It's when the erosion of democracy began in the global north that this phenomenon began to get the kind of attention it now gets. Our diagnoses of when democracy is in crisis and when it is not are typically framed by the experience of the global north. Democracies in Asia and Africa have had multiple crises of their own, but not necessarily at the same time. At one level, this is a caution about the asynchronicity of democracy, democratic ebbs and flows occurring at different times in different parts of the world. But at another, it points to the distinctiveness of the current conjuncture, the fact that crises of democracy are today occurring in every part of the world, North and South. And this may be the big difference between earlier moments of crisis and the present challenges to democracy. One way or another, what all those book titles also indicate is the burden of our expectations from democracy. Now, clearly, few of us would subscribe to the realist definition of democracy that Joseph Schumpeter put out in the 1940s, when he described it as a system in which the primary purpose of the electorate was to produce a government, and the people only having the opportunity to accept or reject the competitive bids made by candidates and parties in an election. We may consider this a cynical view of democracy, but it is also true that we are generally reluctant to admit that the idea of democracy may not be equal to the normative burden we place upon it. We tend to see it as the most convenient rallying cry, even the magic bullet, against whatever version of tyranny or autocracy is before us. But because democracy is the obverse of authoritarianism, we pour all our hopes and political aspirations into this idea, not always acknowledging the ways in which the democratic principle itself can facilitate undemocratic outcomes, or indeed the necessary and sufficient conditions for democracy to perform effectively. Let me start by identifying three important attributes of the state of democracy today and comment also relatedly on the state of our thinking about democracy today. First, democracies are no longer overthrown overnight or by force or military coups. Of course, there are exceptions. In our own neighborhood, Myanmar is an obvious one. But for the most part, the form of democratic erosion has changed. Most autocratic rulers in the present have acquired power through means that appear to be legitimate precisely because they are democratic. And autocratization has therefore become a gradual process rather than a sledgehammer action. Of course, democracy in this context means only elections, not even necessarily high standards of free and fair elections. Voter suppression, for example, is a long-standing issue even in the United States, and it can take on enormously consequential proportions in countries like ours when there is the disappearance of voters of particular communities, sometimes on a large scale, which justifiably raises suspicions about the fairness of the process. We'll discuss these distortions further in a bit. But for the present, let me just say that it remains true that authoritarianism today can be ushered in quite honorably and democratically through elections, and this gives it a democratic appearance and therefore legitimacy. However, and this is the second attribute, while such regimes fall manifestly short of democracy in their functioning, they also fall short of full-scale authoritarianism. Autocrats don't and don't need to openly abandon the idea of democracy. They only redefine it to suit their own purposes, whether to claim glory or to stay in power. This curious phenomenon of autocrats or would-be autocrats acquiring political power through elections is precisely the reason why it has become a trend in my fraternity to refer to these as hybrid regimes. Some people use the term competitive authoritarianism. Others call these authoritarian democracies or democratic authoritarianism, basically finding a way to somehow blend the reality of authoritarianism into what increasingly seems to be the fiction of democracy. Let's look at two such terms. First, the term democratic backsliding. That's the one used by the annual democracy report of VDEM, the typology that VDEM uses, a term that is purely descriptive, that classifies countries into one of four boxes, empty of any normative judgment, and indicating a trend that can be arrested and even possibly reversed. Countries can move up and down on this index. For instance, in 2018, India was pronounced one of the most significant democratic backsliders of the year. In 2020, in the company of states that had regressed and autocratized the most, it found itself downgraded from the status of a liberal democracy to that of an electoral democracy, with a minus sign suggesting that, taking uncertainty into account, the country could soon belong to the lower category of electoral autocracy. And that downward trend was realized in just 1 year. In 2021, VDEM designated India an electoral autocracy. Since 2019, it said, forsaking completely any claim to the term democracy, however minimal. And that is where it remains even in the 2024 report. The second, more popular term, which has great currency, is of course populism. While the causes of right-wing populism have received careful, even thoughtful analysis, and I could have done another 20 slides with pictures of books on populism, but I didn't, only a handful of these analyses of populism have been read back to reflect on the crisis of democracy itself. Is the turn to populism simply the work of unscrupulous politicians who manage to sway electorates, or is there something wanting in the actual democratic experience of these electorates that make them vote for unscrupulous, even if charismatic, politicians? Can we honestly say that all is well with democracy, but only the voter is misguided? And by the way, such an argument was controversially and famously made just a few years ago at the annual meeting of the International Society of Political Psychologists by a Professor Rosenberg of the University of California at Irvine. He dropped a bombshell with a really controversial paper which was titled "Democracy Devouring Itself: The Rise of the Incompetent Citizen and the Appeal of Right-Wing Populism." The paper's argument was that it is the incompetent citizen, lacking in the necessary cognitive capacities, lacking the necessary emotional capacities, that is what is responsible, Professor Rosenberg argued, for the decline of democracy, adding that democracy places demands on citizens, such as the intellectual ability to process information and sift the true from the false, which ordinary citizens just don't possess, hence the phenomenon of democracy devouring itself. But to return to the point I was making, terms like democratic backsliding or populism are helpful in redescribing democracy to more accurately reflect its current condition, but they do not provide explanations. They redescribe, rename, but do not provide explanations for the present crisis of democracy. What this might also mean is that we rename the phenomenon in a sense so that the fair name of democracy isn't tarnished just because a Trump or a Modi or an Erdogan claim it. But of course, renaming it only means that we fail to confront the question of what might be wrong with democracy itself and why it is failing us. This is clearly unsatisfactory from the point of view of knowing what to do about a malfunctioning democracy. The third attribute, whichever type of hybrid regime we are speaking about, the hollowing out of democracy is accomplished through nominally legal, if not always legitimate, means. The rules are violated so often and to such a degree that what we might consider to be the minimum standards of democracy are not met. So there may be regular elections, but if there is also the abuse of state resources to give an unfair advantage to the ruling party, or the denial of media coverage to the opposition, or the harassment of opposition candidates and journalists, or the curtailing of free speech and the dissemination of misinformation, and the countless other familiar ways in which the fairness of elections is compromised. The question is in these circumstances the use of the democratic label even warranted? The important point is that those who hold power may manipulate and even abuse the rules, but they don't get rid of them altogether. They don't, for instance, ban the opposition. They just use subtle forms of persecution to legally harass members of the opposition. And these are standard elements of the autocrat's playbook. And many of them are familiar to us, especially the harassment of journalists and opposition politicians. Remember the recent report on how 95% of political leaders investigated by the CBI and the Enforcement Directorate belonged to opposition parties. Remember also how swiftly and smoothly cases of this kind were withdrawn when some of these leaders joined the ruling party. Likewise, the capture of the media, especially the electronic and social media, to amplify the message of the ruling party. Above all, and perhaps unique to India, was the electoral bond scheme, from which, as we are aware, the ruling party benefited disproportionately compared to other parties. And on this, as on other forms of election funding, fear and intimidation have evidently played a part. So, theoretically, even in hybrid regimes, arenas of contestation continue to exist, through which such rule can be challenged, weakened, potentially even defeated. These arenas, whether electoral or legislative or judicial or media related, remain. They remain as sources of potential instability, giving opportunities to opposition forces to mount challenges. In this way, and despite inherent sources of instability, authoritarian governments can coexist indefinitely with ostensibly democratic institutions. To recap these three attributes of the democratic condition that I've identified very quickly, first, the democratic erosion today commonly takes place through democratic or at least electoral means rather than through force. Second, that this yields hybrid regimes that fall manifestly short of being democratic, but also fall short of full-scale authoritarianism, with the renaming of these as backsliding or populism being an exercise in description rather than explanation. And third, that such regimes hollow out democracy and ensure their own long-term durability by using mostly legal means. So the question is, how and why does democracy allow, even authorize, validate such distortions in its name? Are the core principles of democracy not robust enough to provide safeguards against them? In the time that remains, I would like to discuss the first principles of democracy, some of them normative, and connect them to the state of democracy today and to our thinking about it. And like I said, this could be democratic theory 101. So let me start with the most obvious one, the temporality of democracy, or taking a little liberty with grammar, when is democracy? We're accustomed to thinking about elections as the prime, if not exclusive, democratic moment. There's perhaps more than a grain of truth in Rousseau's mocking of the English as being free only once in 5 years when they voted in the elections and being overtaken by slavery immediately thereafter. As we've already noted, autocrats have found multiple ways of undermining the fairness of the electoral process, whether through voter suppression or voter inflation or electronic voting machines, or simply the power of campaign finance attracted by means foul and fair. This gives us a scenario in which technically democratic means enable the acquisition of power by proto-autocrats who, as holders of public office, devise ways of governing and securing future paths to power which don't always adhere to democratic norms. This is how the democratic pathway is used to hollow out democracy itself, to enfeeble it beyond recognition. A commonly heard argument in popular political discourse in India is that the government is legitimately elected and therefore has the mandate to do whatever it wishes. And of course, the electorate can always vote it out next time round. This is a very common argument we come across. And it's a flawed argument on all three counts. First, how legitimate is an election conducted under less than fair conditions? We have the problem of not just voter suppression, but also voter inflation. The Association of Democratic Reforms recently drew our attention, and that of the Election Commission, for whatever that was worth, to the mismatch in the EC's own data between votes polled and votes counted in the 2024 Lok Sabha election. 5.5 lakh less votes counted than the votes polled in 362 constituencies, and in 176 constituencies, 35,093 votes were counted in excess of the votes polled. Then there are other forms of manipulation, including and especially those relating to doubts about the integrity of EVMs. The broader point being that how legitimate is an election when it's conducted under less than fair conditions? Second, the argument that elected governments have a free hand to do as they wish for 5 years while they're in office does not have any basis in democratic theory. No mandate is absolute and unconditional. In a democracy, it is the job of the opposition to hold the government accountable on a day-to-day basis. And if the opposition is, by force or by intimidation, prevented from performing this role, it is a subversion of democracy. Indeed, it's also the job of the media and of civil society to question the government and hold it accountable. And if they are prevented from performing this role, that too is a subversion of democracy. And third, what are the chances that the electorate will be able to vote out a despotic government next time round if the fairness of the next election has already been compromised in advance by, for instance, things like the electoral bond scheme? So confining democracy to election time is the logical outcome of a minimalist conception of democracy in which the people are free only to periodically choose and remove governments. As opposed to this, a maximalist conception of democracy views it as a method of realizing certain values like justice, dignity, representation, participation, accountability, equality, and so on. Even if, for the sake of argument, we agree with distinguished scholars of democracy like Adam Przeworski that the people themselves must determine through democratic means which values their democracy should strive for, we cannot but recall that we already have in place a framework of values to guide our democracy, and that framework is provided by the Constitution of India, which provides for the infrastructure of democracy beyond elections and political parties. The latter, of course, are not mentioned in the Constitution. But beyond the electoral system in the form of a range of fundamental rights to personal liberty, freedom of speech, freedom of association, the rule of law, and so on. When these are violated and subverted by democratically elected governments through various forms of repression, including the arrest of dissidents using extraordinary laws to trump constitutional freedoms, the very foundations of constitutional democracy are shaken. And academic distinctions between minimalist and maximalist conceptions of democracy become meaningless. The undermining of the values embodied in the constitutional architecture of our democracy becomes deeply concerning. So let me move on to three other features that are commonly considered to be central to the idea of democracy. The first of these is democracy as the rule of the majority. The second is the idea of democracy as political equality. And the third is democracy as representation. Now, the principle of majority rule is what most of us would instinctively identify as the main feature of democracy. Ironically, this is also the principle that is most loudly asserted by autocrats and populists who come to power via elections. This is notwithstanding the recent phenomenon of at least two such leaders claiming that they've been sent by God. Their claim to being Democrats stems from their definition of democracy as majority rule, and only majority rule. It has nothing whatever to do with the values we associate with democracy, values which are enshrined in our Constitution: justice, freedom, equality, non-discrimination, and rights. So the idea of democracy is reduced to the principle of raw numbers. On this view, whatever the majority wills and wants is fair. This majority could be a dominant religious group or a dominant racial group. It could be Hindu supremacists in India or white supremacists in the United States. The legitimating principle is the same. And this is a distortion of the basic premises of liberal democracy in two senses. First, in a democracy, majority rule is only a procedure, the fairest available, but only a procedure, a mechanism for producing a government for all. The premise of the idea of democracy is that though elected by a majority of the voters, once elected, the government is the government of all members of the political community, including the minority who did not vote for it. Second, because democracy acquired its modern form in ethnically homogeneous societies, it was assumed that majorities and minorities would be fluid rather than fixed entities, that minority opinion and majority opinion would change depending on the issue at hand. If democracy is only about the numbers needed to prevail, needed to rule, it can quite easily coexist with a majoritarianism that translates the idea of democracy as majority rule into democracy as the rule of a fixed ethnic or religious majority. And this is precisely the claim championed by the RSS for 100 years, that because the Hindu religious majority is numerically dominant, it is supremely democratic for its interests to be privileged over those of other communities. As the notion of the majority becomes a proxy for democracy, it creates the conditions for democracy devouring itself. As the pure rule of numbers, democracy is a distortion, providing support for majoritarian policies and, along with that, the denial of minority rights. Minority rights are integral to the idea of democracy because they complement the idea of majority rule. The majority is represented in ruling, but minorities also have rights. They not only protect potentially disadvantaged ethnic minorities against discrimination, but they also guarantee the formal equality of all citizens. As we know, majoritarianism can take on a particularly nasty and dangerous form in ethnically diverse and plural societies where a denial of minority rights is a denial of protection to vulnerable minority groups. But also, and this is central to individual-centric democracy, a denial of equal standing to sections of individual citizens who may happen to be members of such minorities. But as an aside, it's interesting, perhaps, that almost every progressive claim in the history of India's democracy, whether it was the claims of minorities in the constitution-making process or the democratization of the polity through the empowerment of backward castes in the 1980s and 90s, almost every progressive claim has made arguments based on numbers. But today's cynical rendering of democracy as numerical superiority is different and alarming because it produces a claim of majoritarian religious supremacy, which, in combination with the nationalism trap, becomes the legitimacy claim of the regime. Let me also mention in passing here that this is actually the obverse of older anxieties about democracy in Western societies historically, where democracy was feared because it held out the prospect of the working classes being in a majority, and people were worried about the possibility of a tyranny of the majority against a small minority of established elites in control of the political process. And that was why, historically, the franchise in older democracies was restricted to those who were educated, those who owned property, those who paid taxes. And that was why the vote of each such person, till just about 100 odd years ago, the vote of each such person, educated, property owning, tax paying, counted for 6 times more than the vote of a member of the laboring classes. Anyway, the objective of interests of classes still clash. The difference today is that the majority has been redefined, not in terms of class, but in terms of religion or race or whatever else, to support claims to dominance and supremacy, often with the threat of minorities being expelled even from formal legal citizenship, let alone equal citizenship. Let me turn to democracy as equality. Now, the only kind of equality that has been seen as intrinsic to democracy is political equality and the principle of one person, one vote, and supposedly one vote, one value. This audience obviously doesn't need to be reminded of the most profound articulation of the idea of equality in relation to democracy in our constitutional history. And I'm referring, of course, to the stirring words of Dr. Ambedkar in that same speech in the closing session of the Constituent Assembly, which I mentioned at the start, in which he warned us that India was about to enter a life of contradictions. I will quote him again with your permission. Quote, "In politics, we will be recognizing the principle of one man, one vote, and one vote, one value. In our social and economic life, we shall, by reason of our social and economic structure, continue to deny the principle of one man, one value. How long shall we continue to live this life of contradictions? We must remove this contradiction at the earliest possible moment, or else those who suffer from inequality will blow up the structure of political democracy which the Assembly has so laboriously built up." Unquote. This is too well known to need belaboring here, except to say that inequality, whether of caste or class or tribe or other forms of disadvantage and marginalization, is clearly an impediment to the realization of democracy. The equal right to vote is meaningless if the social and economic structure is as deeply unequal as that which obtains in our society. Citizens who are poor or lower caste or tribal can neither access nor influence governing institutions in the same way as others can. Inequality also undermines the equal application of the rule of law and dents the mutual respect amongst citizens of equal standing that is a hallmark of democracy. What Dr. Ambedkar called, and I quoted at the start, an attitude of respect and reverence towards fellow men. When did we last see that? But of course, the expectation of the constitution makers, including Dr. Ambedkar, was that democracy itself would be a bloodless path to the social revolution, denting inherited inequalities, creating a modern, more egalitarian society. That expectation has not only been comprehensively belied, we now also have class inequality on a scale that was probably unimaginable in 1950. Unchecked corporate power, not just uncontrolled by the state, but facilitated and enabled by it, has resulted in a concentration of economic power that runs contrary to democracy. The nexus between those holding high public office and the wealthiest people in the land is helped along even by supposedly independent regulatory agencies and the courts bending to their will. Only the other day, India's executive director at the IMF wrote in the Times of India that socialism and communism are European imports, while India's, and I'm quoting now, India's ancient economic philosophy celebrates wealth creation, unquote. This perspective would not be troubled by the fact that the consolidation of elite power conjoined with corporate power has yielded what it has, plutocracy at the top and precarity at the bottom of the social structure. The crisis of capitalism and the inequality it has spawned have contributed to the disenchantment with democracy, which had legitimized the fiction of a free and fair society. It has also exposed the hypocrisy of the liberal guarantee of equal individual freedom, freedom to starve, freedom to be unemployed, freedom to be homeless. Democracy is, and in all the countries that we've been speaking about, in the throes of a legitimacy crisis in which inequality underpins the disillusionment of ordinary citizens with a game of elites. So it shouldn't come as a surprise that in the diagnosis of democracies across the world that have succumbed to the lure of authoritarianism, it is common to find deepening inequality identified as one of the factors that makes autocratic leaders attractive to electorates. The point is that in an unequal society, democracy is and will remain structurally unresponsive to those who are disprivileged by class or caste or tribal identity. From one general election to the next, the Lok Sabha has been registering a rising trend of plutocracy. Go back to ADR data once more on the financial background of candidates and winners of the 2024 election, which shows an increase in the percentage of crorepati candidates from 2009 onwards. If in 2009, 16% of candidates, we're talking about not elected MPs, if 16% of candidates were crorepatis, in 2024, 31% were crorepatis. More compelling is the fact that the 31% crorepati candidates yielded 90% elected MPs, right? This too has been a rising trend in every general election since 2009, showing that, to put it boldly, the richer a candidate is, the higher the chance of their getting elected. What does this do to the idea of representative democracy? Who do plutocrats represent? So this brings me to the third feature of democracy as representation. We accept that representative democracy is the only plausible form of democracy in modern complex societies. Across the world, the reaction to the breakdown of representative democracy to its legitimacy deficit, its broken promises, has found expression in some version of populism that lays claim to being a purer or a more genuine form of democracy. The attraction of populist leaders, as we know, is at least partly the result of discontent with the idea of representative democracy embodied in the institutional form of elected legislatures. In countries where historically representative democracy was at least formally successful, there is the perception that it's been captured by wealthy, self-serving elites. In countries where democracy has been less firmly embedded or is much younger, the frustration of ordinary citizens with corrupt politicians and the unresponsiveness of democratic governance has expressed itself in the preference for strong and even autocratic leadership. So it's effectively the representativeness of representative democracy that is being called into question. At least 2 surveys of attitudes to democracy in India have shown the disillusionment of people with democracy, have shown that they prefer autocratic government, or at least they're not disparaging of it. The Pew Research Center's survey a couple of years ago showed that 55% of Indians support rule by a strong leader or even military rule as a good way to govern. Similarly, the CSTS Lokniti Azim Premji University surveys on society and politics showed that people avow democracy but have a very weak commitment to what we might call liberal democratic values, values of freedom of speech, minority rights, pluralism, and diversity. Populist politicians enter populist politicians who flaunt their direct connection to the people, make grand claims to speak on the behalf of the people, and promise to provide a more responsive democracy than that offered by representative institutions, like elected legislatures, which are thus systematically diminished because populist leaders typically claim to be closer to the people, to represent them more effectively than mediating institutions like legislatures. And in doing so, they tap into that general discontent I was speaking of with representative democracy when people don't see democracy as delivering for them, don't see democracy as enacting their preferences into policy, but instead facilitating rule by self-serving, corrupt politicians who will only advance their own interests. Populists do one other thing. They typically invoke a singular conception of the people, which they claim to represent in its undifferentiated, homogeneous entirety, othering all those who are different in terms of ethnicity, religion, race, whatever it might be, whether openly or through dog whistle messaging. In this form of democracy, there is no place for the representation, for instance, of women or minorities or other disadvantaged sections of society whose interests, concerns, and preferences do not find voice in law and policies. In our parliament, we not only have the increasing presence of plutocrats, we also have the phenomenon of diminishing numbers of women and Muslim members of parliament. The 2024 elections to the 18th Lok Sabha brought 74 women MPs, that's 4 less than in 2019, and just 14% of the House. The 18th Lok Sabha also has the lowest share of Muslim MPs in 60 years, just 24 MPs, 4.4% of the Lok Sabha, and none, of course, from the largest party in the House. So large swathes of the population in this democracy are effectively unrepresented or at best underrepresented. So where does that leave us and our constitutional democracy? We cannot, and should not forget that the deepening of democracy, the vernacularization of democracy, as it was called, the second democratic revolution in the aftermath of Mandal, were achieved precisely through mechanisms of democracy. But it is also equally true, on the other hand, that the recent undermining of democracy has occurred by and through these very processes. What are the implications of all these processes for a democratic future? As is now abundantly evident, institutional mechanisms alone are not enough to resist elected autocrats, because they can and they do weaponize institutions. They pack the courts, they buy off the media, they bully the private sector into silence when they're not considering it, tilt the playing field against political opponents. Essentially, they use the very institutions of democracy to legally subvert it. Take the distinction between the political executive and the permanent executive, the latter being the civil service, whose neutrality is supposed to protect decision-making against political partisanship. When Viktor Orban of Hungary came to power in 2010, one of the first changes he brought about was in the civil service law to make it possible to appoint political loyalists in bureaucratic positions that are supposed to be non-partisan. We've gone a little further. The new rule permitting civil servants to be members of the RSS could be more damaging because it does more than encouraging loyalists. Loyalists can just be time servers, opportunists, and so on. But what this rule does is it brings in the ideological mindset of an organization whose very affinity to the Constitution has historically been in doubt. Just a couple of days ago, we also heard the announcement that 19 BJP ministers in the Maharashtra government will have RSS workers appointed as their personal assistants, neither elected nor duly selected. Their jobs, paid by government, will be to serve as conduits of communication between the Sangh and the state government. So the real bulwark of democracy in such situations are political parties and organized citizens functioning within a democratic public culture. We know well how tax and other laws have been weaponized against opposition parties, but we must also sadly acknowledge that no party has set an example of inner-party democracy. As for a democratic public culture, the chances of sustaining it are generally higher when the media, civil society, universities provide spaces of effective resistance. Not so, however, where political dissidents are subject to arbitrary arrest, where there's a clampdown on academic freedom, where tax laws and FCRA are weaponized against civil society organizations, where the independent media are subject to surveillance, including through the use of spyware, and where the pliancy of the rest is ensured through buyouts, even hostile takeovers sometimes, by corporate conglomerates close to government. Shutting off these spaces effectively throttles democracy. Add to this the deliberate and, dare I say, malicious molding of public opinion through the overwhelming power of the social media. As these media channel misinformation and disinformation, there's little scope for citizens to form opinions freely, express them freely, to test them in and through public debate. This was what the philosopher Hannah Arendt had described as the essence of democratic politics: the clash of opinions formed through public debate in a public space in which all are political equals. Instead, we have sophisticated propaganda machines which exploit the vulnerabilities and anxieties of people and make lies appear as truth. And this isn't only an Indian phenomenon. In the 2018 presidential election in Brazil, Bolsonaro used WhatsApp for a huge campaign of disinformation supported by corporate sponsors. It was said at the time that data was expensive in Brazil, so citizens couldn't fact-check the deliberate misinformation. In India, despite data being relatively cheap, citizens don't seem to want to fact-check. They're happy to believe and forward the daily dose of disinformation that they're fed by the information arm of a powerful political machine. In the US, Sheldon Wolin had argued that unlike 20th century versions of fascism and totalitarianism, the masses are not politically mobilized, but they are politically demobilized and turned into viewer consumers. And what he identified in that context as the tendency of the corporate media to present politics as more or less a spectacular personality contest. That's also true of India now. There was a time when what we call propaganda was easier to identify than the sophisticated and subtle world of political messaging today. And this is difficult, especially because it is often conveyed through ostensibly non-political platforms of social networking. When political opinion is amplified in a deliberately, calculatedly one-sided way, it precludes the possibility of dialogue and deliberation, because what you are seeing repeatedly is being shown to you on the basis of your own viewing history. You're being shown what you need to believe. You're being furnished with evidence as to why you should believe it. Psychologists tell us that the effect of social media on the brain is to provide a dopamine stimulant, so that the brain chemistry of social media addicts is rather like the brain chemistry of drug addicts. We are deluded into thinking that our opinions are uniquely our own, that we have arrived at them by the exercise of our own rationality. We don't realize that they are actually the result of our having been programmed in particular ways with our own complicity, unconscious as it may be. So when political actors use these sophisticated tools to instrumentalize echo chambers, the citizenry has already been molded in ways that we don't recognize as propaganda, even if that's what it is. The insidious consequences of these processes for democracy are not limited to how people vote. And this is important. It has serious consequences also, as we are aware and as we have seen, for social harmony, such as when particular social groups are projected as objects of hate, projected as deserving of violent speech and violent action. These are also the harmful effects of the molding of opinion in particular ways. So in conclusion, what appears to be the dark side of democracy could be the fulfillment of democracy's logic, the democratizing of democracy, as it were, the failure to prevent the capture of democracy by elites, the failure to untether it from deep links with capital, the failure, above all, to address the incompatibility between the political equality that democracy guarantees and the growing material inequality that the capitalist economy generates. All these have made the democratic project open to appropriation by authoritarians masquerading as Democrats. I started my talk by quoting Dr. Ambedkar, so it's sad and it's galling to have to close with a quotation from Goebbels, who in the Nazi propaganda minister, who in 1928 said, and I quote him, "It will always remain one of democracy's best jokes that it provided its deadly enemies with the means by which it was destroyed." Unquote. Almost 100 years on, one might say the joke is truly on us. Thank you. I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Professor Jayal, for this very exhaustive and very thought-provoking presentation And there are many questions, comments from the must be from the audience. But before we invite those other professors, other intellectuals to share their views, I will request my friend and comrade Ravi to share his comment first. And I also invite participants to share their queries in the chat box. Please, Ravi.
Thank you, Subhash. And thank you, Professor Jayal, so much to accept our invitation and for such a comprehensive, insightful, perceptive talk. It resonates so much with what we often discuss internally inside NSI that I will just allow me a minute to just in order to kick off the discussion. One of the puzzles, one of the conundrums we often discuss among ourselves, which has come out very well in your talk, but still maybe, if you can shed some more light on it. What, as you can say, as progressives, we kind of, we are more suspicious of a state, and we would like to believe that we should depend on people to protect ourselves and the people from the problems or infirmities or whatever of state, so that generally takes us to put more emphasis on the electoral process when people supposedly get to speak, as opposed to the constitutional institutional framework, which is more like state, and we are suspicious of state, But when we posit this expectation or hope in people, and when people vote, they seldom vote simply as political agents or economic agents in their own self-interest. There is no such thin political economic voter or agent. They are often very thick voters with their cultural minds, with their identities, and so on. And when the cultural mind and identity comes into play, then we have the likes of Modi and Trump and so on. So then we say that, well, the electoral process is not bringing about necessarily more of democracy. So probably it should be protected, the institutional framework, the constitutional institutional framework. Maybe we should put emphasis on that, and then maybe that framework will help save democracy from the competitive electoral process. So you see the kind of conundrum, the kind of, we feel torn apart. Do we place more hope on values and institutions of democracy, or do we place more hope on people exercising their political agency, which the natural progressive instinct has been to place more hope on people, and people should be allowed to speak more often and more in order for democratic process to be true to itself. But the results are very, as as it has come out so well in your talk itself, Now, we are back to the conundrum or the problem that Dr. Ambedkar pointed out, but the problem is what to do about it. Ideally, we would like to have a virtuous cycle of democracy when more democracy educates the voter better, and then the electoral process itself brings out better results. But all over the world, and especially here in India, as democracy has deepened, as Indian voters have become more politically active, we have this regime that has come to power, and we have this strange journey that we started with Jawaharlal Nehru, and we ended up with Narendra Modi, as a result of deepening of democracy. So many of us, who have spent good time criticizing the state as the state of the ruling class now are forced to say that this constitution should be saved, and who should it be saved from? I mean, I haven't thrown into the mix, the corporate power that complicates the matter further. But even if we take the simple aspect of people not voting in their own interest, people not voting what is good for them, but people voting according to what they like, whom they like, so the interest versus liking, their liking, and their choices, their cultural choices, psychological choices are not necessarily the choices that is good for themselves. So this too, I mean, I don't want to go on and on. Just basically this conundrum that do we place more hope in the constitutional institutional framework of democracy, or do we still place more hope in the electoral process in which people, no matter in what state they are in, they get to speak? Where do you see the hope more?
Would you like me to respond now?
Please.
No, in theory, not all progressives are suspicious of the state. Scandinavian social democracy has seen partnerships between social movements, workers' movements, farmers' movements, women's movements, and the state, which is what brought those social democracies into existence. So it's not an essential quality. In our case, it may have been the case that there's suspicion of the state and a greater reliance on the people. But there are two or three things that come out of what you said. When you say should we be more trusting of the institutional framework, there could be no objection to that, except for what I've already discussed at great length, the fact that autocratic leaders who come to power through ostensibly democratic means have ways in which they compromise the integrity of those institutions and make those institutions do what they were not actually designed to do, to act in ways that are partisan rather than neutral, independent, autonomous. So many institutions, the three branches of government, but also fourth branch institutions have been compromised and subverted in this way. So if we place our trust, therefore, in institutions, that too may not be the optimal solution, right? And as far as the people are concerned, so this again goes back to something I said, let's not see the people as populist leaders do, which is people who will vote once in 5 years or 4 years, whatever it might be, in an election. If we look at people not only as voters, voter is one identity, but they are also active citizens, or can be active citizens, can be mobilized for active citizenship, right? And that is something that the left movement would historically take seriously, a project that they would take seriously, which is that mobilize the people as active citizens, mobilize them to participate, right? And criticize and dissent and all of those things. There are difficulties there too, even today, especially with civil society organizations being targets of attack, with media being less free than it should be, and so forth. But despite that, I think most people who think about the current predicament of democracy would say that it is people voting, not just voters, but people as citizens mobilized to resist. That is the only, that is the only bulwark, that can be the only protection against these distortions that have occurred. And as far as, the point about voting in their own interests, I mean, theories of power have long recognized that people, that how you perceive your interests is how society, how power operates in society to make you think about your own interests. That you begin to think that it's the distinction between subjective and objective interests, if you like, since you belong to that stream of thought, you would know. So it's how we are how we are by the operation of power in society. You could have a Foucauldian view of this or any other view of this, but how we are already molded to think about our interests in particular ways, which may or may not be the objective interests that Mr. Ravi Sinha thinks should be our interests, right? So, yeah, I'll stop there. Thanks.
We are with us Professor Balbir Arora. I will request him to unmute himself and share his comment about the speech. Please unmute yourself.
Thank you, Subhash. I think we've had a real treat. It's not Democracy 101, but 201 and 301 all in 1 hour. And we have been given a very comprehensive state of play on this subject from one of our foremost experts. I think by now we have a fairly clear idea of the playbook of autocracies. We have worked a lot on what democracy means. I think it's now possible to look at the other playbook in a more systematic way and to see, because we sometimes euphemistically talk about hybrid, glass half full, glass half empty, and we look at the way in which, on the one hand, we talk of the pathologies of democracy, the dark side. When does the dark side become the dominant side? That shift is not very easy to observe. You have these gradations, you have freedom, you have the possibility of moving from light to dark and dark to light kind of thing. But I think we need to try and remove some of these scales, if you like, from our eyes and look at things in ways in which one could possibly fix some of these issues. Now, the election is a moment, but institutions are the life between elections. So to put it as an either or, what matters more, what matters less, is, I think, not doing justice to the role that institutions play in democratic life. And with that, I would add 2 or 3 more specific comments. But before I take those 3, I particularly appreciated the quotation from Ambedkar, which talks about fraternity. I think it's one of the lesser worked concepts of our preamble. It's probably because it's difficult to legislate fraternity, to enforce fraternity. You don't have laws for it. But what Ambedkar was saying, I think it's true today, even truer, is that unless we inject fraternity into our democracy in a more meaningful way, liberty and equality, social justice, we are working on. This may be the entry point for resolving some of the pathologies that we witness. Now, for your consideration, Nija, 2 or 3 points that I would like your thoughts on. One is that I hold that the essence of democracy is the centrality of government-opposition relations. If we take the subject from that door, or window if you like, government-opposition relations occur in different spheres, in different pillars of the state, in different levels of the institutional framework, and particularly since I have a special interest in that, in a multi-level federal system. So, government-opposition relations is the life of democracy between elections. And it's a good measure to decide what exactly is the health, if you are looking at it from the pathology and the medical point of view. So, your reflections on that, how does one look at this dimension, particularly in a multi-level federal system? This is not just government-opposition relations in parliament. This is across the union at different levels, and that is something that many would like to erase those levels, to have one election deal with it as one problem rather than as many oppositions everywhere. The second point that I would like your thoughts on, it's again tending towards institutions, because I'm looking at the life of democracy. I'm not looking at the moments when you make choices. You've talked very well of how these choices are framed and how the subconscious and the social media and the spectacle of the state, the elections have become spectacles. Like the gladiators in ancient Rome, you have these debates, and a debate can make or unmake you. I'm talking about other systems. We don't have debating politicians here. So the second point that I wanted to submit is the robustness of checks and balances. How robust are they? If you look at them very closely, they are there in theory. That's part of democratic theory. We know that the whole system is constructed around them. How robust are they is one test of the way of the extent to which you had a slide towards autocracy. And the third element that I would venture to propose is, I think that there is a big difference and a big distinction between elected government and state. State and its institutions are supposed to be separate from what the elected government does by virtue of its elected mandate, the mandate that it receives in an election, and its policies that it's fully entitled and empowered to vote through Parliament. But there is a line. In our system, we have called it the basic structure. That's a judicial definition, that the lines that the government cannot cross in Parliament. But state institutions, which were designed to be independent is a big word, but distinct from government, are being suborned. And now suborning is the use of illicit means to get people, person or institution to do illegal things. Secretive also is part of it. I've talked about it. So this distinction between state and government, I think, is crucial to understanding how we can think about these. And I have other things, but I think I've talked too much, and I'll stop here.
May I respond, Subhashji? Yeah. Thank you, Professor Arora, so very much for those really important points. I completely agree with you, especially on the first two. The centrality of government-opposition relations, couldn't agree more. You know, if there's been any pushback at all against policies that you know we may have difficulty with, that pushback in the past decade or so has come from the states, whether it was state legislatures passing resolutions on the CA and RC, whether it's now the UGC draft regulations on a whole range of issues. The pushback has actually come from the states, and this is despite the politicization of the office of the governor. So yes, definitely that is one of our greatest strengths. But like you said, attempts are being made to undermine the federal structure as well, and I mean, we've moved from a situation where we were told, what was the phrase? Cooperative federalism would be the way forward, and I mean, there's very little cooperation that is evident and manifest now. But so it's really left to the states to push back, which they have done in many cases. So I completely agree there. On checks and balances, yes, I agree with you that it's a test of the extent to which the slide has occurred. And certainly the separation of powers and checks and balances together have not worked in the way that they are supposed to work. The separation between between different branches of government has been less than one would want it to be. So to that extent, I think any measure, if anyone was to measure the robustness of checks and balances, might come to the conclusion that they are not terribly robust, right? Which I think is, in a sense, what you were trying to say. On the last point about distinction between elected government and state, yes, in theory. But in practice, basic structure notwithstanding, there is increasingly thinking now in terms of, and this is presumably borrowed from the Chinese experience, the party state, hyphenated party state. So when the distinction between, it's not just government and state, it becomes party state. It's more challenging, arguably. And a couple of people have written about this. I'm not familiar with what the sort of what the details of this theory are, but it has been posited as a way of describing our present. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
No, the Confucian democracy you're talking about.
No, I'm talking about party state.
Which
Party-state. Actually, Doipayan wrote about this in the context of Bengal in his book a couple of years ago. And Pratap has since written about it in an article in Studies in Indian Politics about 2 years ago. So talking about India, Doipayan's was about Bengal. So yeah, these are two people who've actually used this concept.
I will request Comrade Bhargav to share a question in the chat box. Comrade Bhargav, please.
Thank you, Subhash. There is a question from Mr. Pradeep Nayak. It is, Indian democracy is all about accommodation. You wrote in your introduction to Indian democracy book, and now he is asking, would you like to revise your premise, madam?
Yeah. So after a question from my former teacher, I have a question from my former student, Pradeep Naik. Pradeep, I can't see him, but anyway, yes, of course. I mean, one would revise. It's a change situation that one is describing. So obviously, one needs to think differently about the present and the democratic present, which is very different from what it was in the late 90s when that was published. And at that time, if I remember correctly, I actually don't remember that introduction to that book so clearly now, but accommodation was a part of it. So was the question of the theory of consociationalism, the fact that minorities could have vetoes and so forth. That too was a way of thinking about democracy at the time. But clearly, today's democracy is a very different democracy, and some might not even call it a democracy anymore. So clearly, we need to think differently about it.
There is another question from Mr. Srinivasa Bulusu. Thank you very much, Professor. Your insights are very elucidating. I would like to inquire whether the rise of social networking in last 2 decades is enabling the authoritarian, majoritarian, and regressive forces. Is there a clear relationship between them? If so, how to accomplish the delinking of social networks and social consent manufacturing?
You mean social media, Mr. Bhargav? Yeah,
I think
no.
so. I think so. That must be the
Yeah. So when social media was in its early phase, many people, many commentators, and there are books on this, were very excited about it and kept talking about the democratization of the internet. And they talked about democratization because anyone could access the internet, though it wasn't strictly speaking true, because you needed digital access, you needed a device. And this was more a global north phenomenon at the time, but it was celebrated hugely as a great advance that that people could actually express themselves freely, openly. They didn't need a forum. They could just go on Twitter or whatever the equivalent was at the time to express their views and be heard. So that democratizing aspect of social media was hugely emphasized about 15 years or 10, 15 years ago. But in the more recent past, the ways in which social media can be manipulated uh, and 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 the ways in which messages can be channeled through social media, which are emanating from a political machine, which are being circulated by bots, not even necessarily human beings, which are low cost, easy to put out, and which propagandize, that has become a reality everywhere. So, like I mentioned, Bolsonaro's election using WhatsApp. Um, American elections have been seen as hugely influenced by social media as well. Our elections and our politics too. So yes, there has occurred a change in the way we look at social media and in the way in which we regard the potential of social media, the political potential of social media. On the one hand, it is democratizing; everyone can have their say. But on the other hand, it can also amplify hate. It can amplify violent speech, violent action, and so much else that disturbs society. So yeah.
Thank you very much, Professor. There is a question from Denzel Fernandez. Thanks, Professor Jayal, for unraveling the state of democracy in India and the world. I have two questions. One, how can we protect the popular mandate from being vitiated by the corporate power over democratic processes by oligarchs? Two, how can we dismantle the architecture for autocratic rule in a democratic framework since the judiciary has failed us? Three, so far Sri Lanka and Bangladesh have shown that popular uprising can remove autocrats who rule under the guise of democracy. Can such a scenario happen in India?
Well, I mean, I think the answers are contained in the questions themselves, Mr. Fernandez. How can we protect the popular mandate from being vitiated by corporate power? I don't think that um, the constitutional framework, the legal structures that we have can actually prevent this. It is something that elected governments are facilitating. So how do you actually prevent it from, how do you protect the popular mandate from this is a question that is not easy to answer, as is the second question you've asked, which is how can we dismantle the architecture for autocratic rule since the judiciary has failed us? The judiciary has failed us, the executive has failed us, the legislature fights back valiantly a little bit, but is unable to, obviously doesn't have the numbers to protect us. Can Sri Lanka or Bangladesh happen? I don't think so. I think the scale is very different. And in any case, Sri Lanka, of course, has had a democratic election. Bangladesh is still in a state of flux. So hard to say what this in the longer term results in terms of democratic stabilization. It's hard to say.
Our friend Professor Shekhar Ramakrishnan had shared a question. I will request him to share that question himself. Shekhar, please.
I'm sorry, I don't feel competent at all in this topic here. And I also managed to get myself in the dark here. I apologize. So thanks, Professor Gopal. It was very, very instructive for me. And, I'm very grateful for that. My big problem, and to sort of elaborate maybe on what Ravi talked about, to me, it seems that democracy turns into majoritarianism. And I just don't see some way that to prevent that, because I really don't see the majority population, Hindus in India or the whites in the US, actually voting in their self-interest. It seems to me that it's much easier to mobilize them based on the other, that their dislike for the other. So anyone who comes along and says, I'm going to do something bad to the minorities, throw out immigrants in the US or deny citizenship rights to Muslims in India, they are able to get votes from the majority population. And, there was some time ago in Kentucky, the Democrats lost the election even after Obamacare came into effect, which helped vast numbers of poor whites in Kentucky. So those poor whites were happy to vote for a Republican candidate who was opposed to what they were getting from the legislation. So I'm just very pessimistic. So I'll shut up now.
No, thank you for those comments. I mean, I share your pessimism, but we are in a particular moment at this point. If you think about, not that this is a very rousing example, but if you think about the recent election in the UK, for instance, the party that is voted out, the Conservatives, did sponsor Brexit. It is the party whose ministers were wanting to ship refugees to Rwanda. So it was not othering on the scale in which we see it here or in the United States, but there was an element of that. And that party has been voted out. So maybe, this is the moment we're living through, and it may not always be like this. It may be like this in our lifetimes, but it, presumably can change. The thing that I have difficulty with is the point that you raised just now and that Ravi raised earlier, which is about self-interest. You see, there's always an assumption in our conversations that we know what other people's objective self-interest is. And I think it's time to examine that assumption. Can we decide for other people what their self-interest is, or should we really engage with the structures of power, including ideological power? Should we not think about those structures that actually that color people's perceptions, that mediate people's perceptions of what their self-interest is? So I think a little bit of reflection on that, a self-reflection, if you like, might be helpful. Maybe a future dialogue, you could discuss that issue.
Professor Jayal, I would like to take two questions from chat box, which I think are somewhat related to each other, so that you can respond together. One is from Alok Tandon. How to prepare people as citizens to be mobilized to resist autocracy when they are already made immobilized by capitalism, state, media, as consumers? This is one question. And there is another question from Hardeep Grewal. How outdated is democracy? Has it outturned its historical positivity?
Okay, both very provocative questions. On Mr. Tandon's question, let me give you a counterexample. Farmers were mobilized and stayed mobilized for a year and won their point by getting the farm laws retracted, at least at that point, right? They were mobilized to resist autocracy, and the attempt of both state and corporates failed in the face of their protests. If you look at the spontaneity of the protests against the Citizenship Amendment Act and the NRC, that too was a protest that people were not, nobody mobilized them, but people came together and expressed their anguish at these. And while one can't say that that particular protest succeeded in full, it certainly is the case that it took many years before the rules of the Citizenship Amendment Act were notified, just in about, I think, March or April last year, just before the election, and in a form that they really aren't quite implementable anyway. So it might have been less than a complete victory, less of a victory than the farmers' protest were. It is possible to mobilize people. The point is that such mobilization often needs social movements, which do find it difficult to fight back in the face of repression. But it does require social movements and political parties. The point is, we allow political parties to we give them an out, basically. What are our parties doing to mobilize people? What are they doing to mobilize immobilized people? What are they doing to educate them about their objective interests, to use Mr. Ramakrishnan's and Ravi's words? What are they doing? I think those are questions that we need to ask ourselves.
You made an interesting point in your speech that this situation has arisen because of with deepening of democracy, the situation which we find here. And I was reminded of your book, that the title Reforming India. In the introduction, you talked about the radical break, which is anchored in a fundamental revisioning of India in social, cultural, and even moral terms. So that you talked about. So how does one, with the deepening of democracy, if such thing as occurring, how does one understand it? Like the query, the puzzle which we have been facing, like at the time of Nehru, when India was not much illiterate, we had this very progressive constitution, and with this deepening of democracy, this situation has arisen. Just that query is very much there. You answered it, but I'm repeating it.
I stand by both. The expression deepening of democracy belongs to the mobilization by backward castes in the 1980s and the implementation of Mandal 1. That is what deepening of democracy, when we went from an OBC representation in parliament in the first Lok Sabha, 1952, was 5%. We went to 25% OBC representation in the 90s. So deepening of democracy was in that context. And that is what Yogendra Yadav, back then in a very famous article, called the Second Democratic Revolution, right? The first being the Constitution, I guess. So the reference to deepening of democracy belongs to that period. It was also called the vernacularization of Indian democracy, and there were many other sort of celebratory terms used to describe that moment. But by 2014, no, what I've written in that introduction to Reforming India, where the hyphen is very important in reforming, the attempt to reform it, not reform it, but reform it, form it again, anew. That is definitely not a form of deepening democracy. It's a fact of hollowing out democracy. And that is what we are seeing now, is the hollowing out of democracy, the hollowing out of institutions, the hollowing out of even a democratic public culture. That's also been hollowed out. So no longer would I call this deepening democracy. I wouldn't call this, this phenomenon would not be labeled deepening of democracy. That phenomenon was labeled rightly the deepening of democracy.
Thank you. Thank you. Bhargav, please take up in the other question in the chat box.
There is a question from Sharada Prasanna. The Indian society divided on the basis of different identities, then how come we will strengthen democracy with all the difference?
Sharda is my former student. So thank you for your question, Sharda. The point is, in a 75-year-old history, it is only in about 10, 11 years that the weakening of democracy by identity politics has taken place. Even if you argue that the OBC mobilization was a form of identity politics, that was something that strengthened rather than weakened democracy. But we have had 60 years of democratic experience in which pluralism and diversity have been central to our political life, and there was no difficulty whatever. Yes, it is true that every minority and every disadvantaged group did not necessarily have an equal voice or enough of a voice, but it is a fact that all democracies are works in progress. No democracy is a finished work. So, in that sense, those were works in progress, but they were taking place in the context of a plural democracy whose plurality and diversity was valued in society as well. Now one might say, and this is the question about interest, subjective or subjective, that we were sorry. The term Ravi that I was thinking of was false consciousness. It wasn't coming to me, but that's the term, right? So one could argue that that was a form of false consciousness, or one could argue that this moment of toxicity is a form of false consciousness. It's hard to say, but it certainly is the case, Sharda, that going forward, even if some kind of an electoral upset could take place and you had a different kind of government and leadership in place, even then, I think the toxicity that has been introduced in our society, now it's not just polity and elections we're talking about, but the toxicity that has been introduced into our society is not going to be easy to get rid of. There will have to be a generational change for that to happen.
Subhash, if I can jump in for the second time.
Sure, please.
I was wondering if on another topic, if it is too dangerous or treacherous to bring in civilizational discourse in the context of democracy. For example, Professor Balveer Arora referred to in his talk, which was the previous talk, and today also he referred to this Confucian democracy. Generally, and we also discuss among ourselves, there is hardly one can do anything to the civilization we are, but probably if we pay attention to the makeup of a civilization, the strategy to institute and deepen democracy in a given civilization may be different, and that may also be that there are different forms or frameworks of democracy suitable for different societies and civilizations. So I know it is a very large topic, but I mean, if you could comment on, do you think that thinking about civilizations in the context of modernity, or in the context of modern state, or in the context of democracy per se, is opening Pandora's box? It is a dangerous thing to do. We should just stick to modernity and modern constitution and electoral process, and don't bring in the cultural civilizational discourse into brooding over democracy.
No, it's an attractive idea, but of course we know that, the idea of civilizations is also hugely politicized and politicizable, right? We have one construction of our civilization that is quite different from the conception of civilization that you and I may have. And textbooks are being rewritten to advance a particular conception of Indian civilization, which which are quite different from how Indian civilization was perceived in a more inclusive and in an era when diversity and pluralism were respected. So it is fraught. It's an enterprise that is worth pursuing, but it's an enterprise that is also fraught with many dangers, I would say, many dangers. And I mean, for instance, this new publication that I have yet to see, I've only seen a summary of it, which is called Mother of Democracy. So we're basically telling Athens, and all the others that have laid claims to being the first democracies, that we are the original, and this is civilizational. So the shorter version of that document, which I have read, which is about 20 pages, does actually make this claim that democracy is part of our civilizational heritage, from 5000 BC. So when such claims are made, we do need to regard them with a little bit of care. So yeah, thanks.
Yeah.
Talking of ancient Athens, for your entertainment, apparently the ancient Athenians, their democracy was deficient in many ways, including the exclusion of slaves and women and so on. But evidently, they had an interesting system of ostracizing people. They had a practice by which citizens would vote by a 2/3 majority to banish unduly popular leaders. So the people that we consider charismatic, popular, hugely popular, if they were too popular, they could be banished by 2/3 majority of all the citizens voting, and they would have to leave the city within 10 days. So, sorry.
I think once again.
Can I ask a question? Can I
thanks.
ask a question? I'm calling from US. I wanted to ask Dr. Jayapal a question. Can I ask, please?
Please.
My name is Reddy Kasuri, and I've been communicating with my friends across the pond into India. One of the things we're discussing about this particular talk by Dr. Jayapal, and my question is to her is, this is all a cycle of life. I look at it as a cycle of life. As she mentioned, Athens, democracies, they say they started in India as well as in Athens and ran its course and died into forming an autocracy. And then it reborn again in Iceland and later in the United States, where I live. And then it's run its course, spread, and it's committing suicide again. And it's starting up the new cycle. Could she comment on that one, please? Thank you.
Well, what can I say except that it's I guess it's the luxury of democracies which have been around a couple of 100 years to be able to think in terms of cycles. Ours is quite young yet, and it is hard to foresee a cycle in our context as of now. At least for me, I don't have the imagination to be able to envision it. But it's a comforting thought. Since you put it out, it's a comforting thought, and I hope we will also see the cycle turning back.
Yeah. I think with this note,
The cycle coming back to the autocracy for next 1,000 years, and then a democracy be born again. Is that what you're saying?
No. I'm saying that if you are seeing that, cycles can go from autocracy to democracy and then back to autocracy, if that's the representation of the cycle that you're suggesting, then all I'm saying is that I would be happy if the cycle was to move in the direction of democracy once again. That's all. I can't talk of 1,000 years, definitely not. Thank you.
with this note, I think we conclude this interesting talk. I thank once again Professor Niraja Gopal Jayal for this thought-provoking presentation. I thank participants also for joining the discussion. And thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much for the invitation. Thank you so much. Thank you.